The strangest part wasn't waking up. It was waking up and already knowing. Not knowing what had happened to my body, the nurses explained that soon enough, with their careful voices and their careful eyes that never quite met mine. Not knowing how long I'd been gone. 11 days, they said, like it was a simple thing, like 11 days was just a number and not a lifetime I had missed. No, what I already knew before anyone said a word, before I'd even fully understood that I was breathing on my own again, was that something had shifted in the architecture of my family that could never be rebuilt. My name is Clara Wells. I was 29 years old and I was a hospital billing analyst. I sat in gray cubicles under fluorescent lights and read the language of illness the way other people read novels, line by line, looking for what didn't fit. I was good at it. I was good at finding the number that was slightly too round, the procedure code that didn't match the diagnosis, the claim that had been filed a day before the patient was even admitted. I was precise, I was thorough, and I was quiet. People always mention the quiet. I had 14 houseplants in my apartment. I watered them every morning before work in a specific order, starting with the one closest to the window and ending with the one on the bathroom shelf that got the least light. I talked to them sometimes, not because I thought they could hear me, but because they were the only things in my life that asked absolutely nothing back. I should have found that sad. I didn't. Here's what I want you to understand before this story goes any further. I did not set out to destroy my father. I want to be clear about that, because what happened to Richard Wells in the 2 days after I came home from the hospital looks from the outside like a daughter's revenge, and maybe that's the only honest word for it. But from the inside, from the place where I was living when I made every single choice, it felt like something quieter than revenge. It felt like returning something that had always belonged to me, my own life. Before we dive into how I reclaimed the narrative, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this story. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below in the comments. Now let me take you back to where it all began. My father built things. That is the first and most essential thing you need to understand about Richard Wells. He built things the way other men breathed. Compulsively, necessarily, without ever stopping to ask why. He built his first real estate business from a $10,000 loan he took from his own mother in 1987. By the time I was born, he had an office on the 14th floor of a building he also owned, and a view of the Seattle waterline that he never once looked at, because he was always at his desk, building the next thing. I used to think that made him extraordinary. For most of my childhood, I believed it completely. He was tall in the way that commands a room without trying, not physically imposing, but architecturally present. When Richard Wells walked into a space, the space reorganized itself around him. Conversations shifted, postures changed. Even my mother, Diane, who was the most quietly intelligent person I have ever known, would orient herself toward him when he entered, the way a plant turns toward a window. He had that quality, that gravity. I worshipped him for it. My earliest memory, the one that sits at the very bottom of everything, the foundation stone, is from when I was 6 years old. It was a Saturday in November, which meant the sky over Seattle was the color of old pewter, and the rain was so constant it had stopped being weather and become just atmosphere. My father was working, because my father was always working on Saturdays, but that particular Saturday, he stopped. He came into the living room where I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by index cards, organizing them into categories that only I understood: animals, colors, countries, things that were round. My mother told me later that she'd been watching from the doorway for a full minute before I noticed either of them. My father sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, not on the couch, on the floor, cross-legged, in his work trousers and his pressed shirt, right in the middle of my index card landscape. He said, "Tell me the system." So I did.
I explained every category, every subcategory, the logic of placement, why the round things overlapped with the colors in one corner but not in another. He listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "That's a very good system, Clara. You think in grids." And then he went back to work. That was it. That was the whole memory. 20 minutes on a Saturday floor. And yet I have carried it for 23 years like it was gold. Because from my father, attention was currency. And that afternoon, he was briefly, magnificently rich with it.
My mother died when I was 9. Pancreatic cancer, which is almost always a death sentence and almost always a fast one, and hers was both. She was gone within 7 months of diagnosis. I remember very little of those 7 months in any linear way. It comes back in textures and temperatures rather than events. The specific scratch of a hospital blanket, the smell of the soup my aunt brought every Tuesday, the sound of my father on the phone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, his voice low and careful in a way it never was during business hours. After she died, my father did not fall apart. I have never been sure whether that was strength or something else. He reorganized the house within 2 weeks, not callously but efficiently, the way he organized everything. Her things were boxed and stored, not thrown away. The household schedule was adjusted. A housekeeper was hired. Victor, my brother, who was 12 then, and already built in my father's image, became quieter and more purposeful, and I became the girl who watered things. My father paid for everything. Good schools, music lessons I asked for and then quit, a laptop when I was 13 that was better than anything my classmates had. He came to graduations, he signed the forms. He was, by every measurable standard, a present and functional parent. But you learn, as the daughter of a man like Richard Wells, to receive love in the currency he deals in, and his currency was provision, not warmth, resources, not water. He would not sit on the floor of your living room again. That was a one-time offer, and you'd spent it at 6 years old, and you were grateful, and you didn't ask for more. I built my life to fit that shape. I chose a profession where precision mattered more than personality. I lived alone and liked it. I had friends who respected my privacy, which is a polite way of saying friends who didn't push. I visited my father every other Sunday for dinner, a ritual he initiated when I graduated college, which I interpreted at the time as an olive branch, and later understood was closer to a maintenance schedule. He wanted to know I was functional. He wanted to check the metrics. Those Sunday dinners, though, for a long time they were enough. There were evenings, a handful of them, precious and specific, when my father would set down his fork and actually look at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, with something in his expression that I can only describe as recognition, like he was seeing someone he hadn't expected to find interesting and was recalculating. "You're sharper than you let people see," he told me once, over salmon and white wine, when I'd said something offhand about a hospital administration policy that he found unexpectedly insightful. I held that sentence for months. I told my plants about it. That is the before. That is the part of the story where the ground was solid and I was standing on it, and I believed, despite all evidence and all logic, that my father's version of love was enough to build on. I was wrong, but being wrong about that took a long time, and the wrongness arrived slowly, the way damage always does when the structure looks fine from the outside. Looking back now, I can see the exact shape of it. I couldn't see it then. You almost never can when you're inside it, when you're the one who has organized your entire emotional life around a relationship, when you have spent 23 years fluent in a specific language of love, and you are suddenly, without announcement, being spoken to in a different one. The shifts were small. That is the thing about slow erosion. It doesn't announce itself. There's no moment of rupture. There's just the day you notice the cliff edge is a little closer than it was, and you think, when did that happen? My brother Victor started joining our Sunday dinners. That sounds harmless. It was harmless. Victor and I had a relationship I would describe as cordial and architecturally correct. We knew our roles, we performed them competently, we did not require warmth from each other because our family had not trained us to expect it. He was 3 years older, the firstborn son, already working in my father's company as a junior development manager. He was good at it. He had my father's instinct for structure and none of my mother's tendency toward interiority. Victor joining the Sunday dinners changed the gravitational field. With the two of them together, I became the audience rather than the conversation. The topics shifted: development projects, city zoning, investment returns, the commercial real estate market's post-pandemic adjustments. Important topics I simply didn't inhabit professionally. I would sit across the table and eat my salmon, and occasionally make a comment that would receive a nod, and then be absorbed into the ongoing architecture of their exchange. "You must be bored," Victor said once, with what I think was intended as a joke. "Not at all," I said. I was performing, and I think some part of me knew it. Then came the conversation about the Meridian account. I should explain what Meridian was because it matters later. It matters enormously. The Meridian account was my father's primary investment vehicle for his Pacific Northwest properties. He'd built it over 15 years into something substantial, a private holding structure that processed income and expenses across multiple LLCs. Complex, but legal. That's what I believed at the time. That's what I had every reason to believe. About a year before my accident, I was reviewing billing files at work, routine audit preparation, and I came across 2 claims that were connected through 3 layers of administrative structure to a shell company I recognized. I recognized it because it appeared, occasionally and peripherally, in financial documents my father had once shown me during a Sunday dinner conversation about estate planning. I flagged the claims internally. I documented them carefully, the way I documented everything, and I escalated them to my direct supervisor with a written summary. 2 weeks later, my supervisor told me, in a tone of deliberate patience, that the claims had been reviewed and were within acceptable parameters. I didn't push further. That is something I have had to sit with, the decision not to push further. I told myself it was because I trusted the process, but I think the honest answer is that I was not ready at that point to follow that thread to where it ended. Because I already half knew where it ended. And there are things we half know that we protect ourselves from fully knowing for as long as we possibly can. Meanwhile, the Sunday dinners continued their quiet erosion. My father began to talk about his estate plans more directly. He and Victor were restructuring, consolidating, he called it. There was language about trusts, about beneficiary designations, about streamlining the legacy. I was included in these conversations in the way that furniture is included in a room, present, positioned, but not load-bearing. One evening, I asked directly about my own position in the restructuring. My father looked at me over his wine glass with an expression I have spent a year trying to name correctly. It wasn't cruelty. It was something almost more wounding than cruelty. It was the absence of the question having occurred to him. "We'll make sure you're looked after," he said. Not, "You're part of this." Not, "Let me walk you through your role." Looked after. Like I was a dependent. Like I was a detail to be managed rather than a daughter to be included. I drove home that night and watered my plants in the dark. All 14 of them. I didn't turn the lights on. I just moved through the apartment by feel, tipping each can, listening to the water settle into the soil. I told myself I was fine. I had gotten very good at telling myself I was fine. 3 months later, a truck ran a red light on the corner of 5th and Madison and hit my car on the driver's side, and the next 11 days of my life became a blank. I want to tell you what I was told, and then I want to tell you what I confirmed. What I was told came from a nurse named Priya, not Dr. Nair, but a floor nurse, older, with the specific manner of someone who has been delivering difficult information for so long that she has found a way to make it feel like care rather than demolition. She sat beside my bed on day 12, the morning after I'd been moved from the ICU to a standard room, and she told me that my father had been called within an hour of my admission. She told me that the surgical team had assessed my injuries and determined that an emergency cranial procedure was necessary to relieve pressure on my brainstem. The cost of that procedure, inclusive of the specialist team and ICU care, was significant. She said the number quietly. I won't repeat it here, but I will tell you that it was a number that would not have created a single measurable difficulty for Richard Wells's financial situation. She told me that my father had reviewed the cost with the hospital's financial liaison. She told me that he had then signed the Do Not Resuscitate order. She told me all of this in the gentlest possible voice, and she held my hand while she told it, and I lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling tiles and felt something very strange happen inside my chest. Not pain, not yet, but a kind of structural settling, like a building after an explosion, still standing, adjusting to the new weight of what was missing. He said, "Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery." She told me those exact words because I asked for them. I asked her 3 times to repeat them, until I was certain I had them right, until the syllables were correctly placed in my memory where they would stay forever. Let her go, we won't pay for the surgery. Here is what I need you to understand about hearing those words. The pain was not where I expected it to be. I had braced for grief, for the rupturing of the childhood I'd built on that Saturday floor, for the collapse of the image of my father that I had been maintaining at significant personal cost for 29 years. Those things came later. What hit first, instantly, physically, like something sharp entering the body, was the specific, humiliating clarity of my own value in my father's ledger. I was a liability. I had always been a liability, and he had simply, in the emergency room of the hospital where I worked, done the math out loud. There were witnesses, Priya told me, the surgical resident who had prepared the procedure, 2 nurses, the financial liaison who later said in her own account that she had never in 17 years of hospital administration seen a family member make that decision that quickly. The attending surgeon, Dr. Nair, had requested a 48-hour hold before the DNR was enacted, citing ethical protocols. A decision that, combined with my own body's refusal to complete the task my father had assigned me, kept me alive. Dr. Nair did not say anything to me directly about what she had witnessed. She didn't have to. I knew the language of clinical documentation. I would later read the nursing notes from day 1 of my admission. Family member, father, visibly untroubled. Signed DNR at 21:47. Attending physician requested ethics consult. Family member declined further conversation and departed at 22:03. Visibly untroubled. He'd been there for 16 minutes. Victor had not come at all. I lay in that hospital bed for the rest of the day after Priya told me, and I did not cry. People came and went. Nurses, the resident who had been in the room that night, a hospital social worker who asked how I was doing with a face full of careful professional concern. I answered their questions. I was polite. I was, I imagine, somewhat unnervingly calm. My father came the next morning, day 13. He brought yellow tulips. He set them on the bedside table and said, "I'm so glad you pulled through, sweetheart." And he leaned down and kissed my forehead the way he had not kissed my forehead since I was 9 years old and being told my mother was gone. The intimacy of it landed on me like a violation. I looked at him. I said, "Me too, Dad." And I smiled, and he smiled back, relieved. I could see the relief clearly, the slight drop in his shoulders, the way his jaw unclenched, and he stayed for 20 minutes, talked about the weather and a development project in Bellevue, patted my hand once, and left. At the door, he turned and said, "Rest up. We'll get you back on your feet." I watched him walk down the hallway until he was gone. Then I reached for my phone, which the nurses had kept charged on the nightstand throughout my coma because they were kind people, doing kind things in a building where unkind things also happened. And I opened my voicemail. And there it was, sitting in my inbox from day one, a message my father had meant to leave for Victor and had left for me instead, because Victor and I are adjacent in his contacts list, and Richard Wells is never been good with technology. 47 seconds. His voice, calm and businesslike, the way it always was when he was managing a logistical problem. "The policy won't cover the procedure anyway. I'm not touching the Meridian account for this. Make sure the doctor knows we're not authorizing anything beyond stabilization. And call Morrison at the insurance office. I want to make sure the existing claims aren't affected by any of this." Any of this. I was any of this. I saved the voicemail to 3 separate locations. Then I lay back on the pillow and looked at the ceiling and thought about 14 houseplants sitting in my apartment, unwatered, waiting for me to come home. I was going to be okay. I was going to be more than okay. But first, I needed to go back to work. I'm going to pause here for a second. If this story is resonating with you at all, or if you've ever felt the pain of being reduced to a number by someone who was supposed to love you most, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really lets me know that sharing these hard stories is worth it. I was discharged on day 14. My father did not come to pick me up. A hospital transport service drove me home. I had requested this myself, quietly, through the discharge coordinator, citing recovery comfort, but the real reason was that I did not want to be inside a car with Richard Wells again for any length of time while I was still processing what I now knew. I needed the geography of my own mind to be clean and uninterrupted. The apartment smelled like soil and still air and the particular quiet of a space that has been empty for 2 weeks. I went to every one of my plants first. I watered them in order, slowly, all 14. Some of them had dropped leaves. The peace lily by the east window, which is dramatic and communicative, had gone almost entirely limp. The pothos trailing from the kitchen shelf had yellowed at the tips, but everything was alive. Everything had held on. I found that disproportionately meaningful. I still do. Then I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began. I want to describe this process accurately because I think people imagine revenge as hot, as something fueled by adrenaline and anger, something frantic and operatic. What I experienced was the opposite of that. What I felt, sitting at my desk in my quiet apartment in the first hours of my first day home, was something close to professional flow, the particular state of clarity that arrives when you are doing exactly the thing you are built to do. I was a billing analyst. I found the numbers that didn't fit. I had been finding Richard Wells's numbers for a year without letting myself finish the equation. Now I was going to finish it. The shell company I had flagged in those 2 claims 14 months earlier was called Meridian Pacific Holdings, LLC. I now knew, from the voicemail, that it was the vehicle through which my father processed what he called the Meridian account. I also knew, from the voicemail, that he was specifically concerned about existing claims being affected, which meant those claims were active, which meant the pattern I had partially mapped was still ongoing. I opened my personal copies of the flagged documentation I had compiled before my accident. I am a meticulous person. I keep records the way some people keep photographs, obsessively, categorically, organized by date and relevance. I had 17 months of carefully archived irregularities, annotated and cross-referenced, sitting in an encrypted folder on my personal drive. I worked for 12 hours the first day. Then I slept for 10 hours and worked for another 9.
What I found, what I had half found 14 months earlier and been too afraid to complete, was a pattern of fraudulent medical insurance claims routed through Meridian Pacific Holdings and submitted to 3 separate insurance providers over a period of 10 years. The claims were sophisticated enough that they had passed through standard audit processes, but they were not sophisticated enough to survive a dedicated, informed, professional review, specifically the review of someone who not only understood hospital billing architecture, but had personally flagged 2 of the source documents and knew exactly where the seams were. There were 43 claims in total. The cumulative fraudulent value was significant enough that when I later learned the figure confirmed by investigators, I sat very still for a long moment and thought about yellow tulips on a hospital bedside table. I did not call my father. I did not call Victor. I did not call a lawyer, though I knew I should eventually. What I did at 10:47 on the evening of my second day home was submit a formal, fully documented, anonymously attributed whistleblower complaint to the Washington State Insurance Commissioner's Office and a parallel filing to the IRS whistleblower program. Both submissions were thorough. Both were accurate. Both cited specific claim numbers, specific dates, specific routing pathways, and specific discrepancies. I had spent 2 days building something airtight, and it was airtight. Then I did one more thing. I composed a single email to a journalist, a financial reporter in a Seattle publication whose work I had read and whose precision I respected. I attached the voicemail. I attached a 3-page summary of the pattern I had documented. I did not include my name. I explained only that I was a credentialed professional with direct knowledge of the subject matter and that I was providing the information in the public interest. I pressed send at 11:23 p.m. Then I made tea, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in years. Victor called on the morning of day 16. I was watering my plants. His voice was the voice of a man whose world is reorganizing around him without his permission. Tight, high, controlled, but barely. "Clara, what did you do?" I looked at the peace lily. It was already recovering, the leaves lifting slightly, responding. "I went back to work," I said. "Clara, don't." I hung up. My father called 4 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Then his attorney called from a number I didn't recognize, and I let that go too. Then Victor called again, and this time he was not controlled at all. His voice was cracked down the middle, and he said things I will not repeat here because they belong to him, not to me, and I have no interest in carrying them. By the end of that day, the journalist had published. By the end of the following morning, Richard Wells's primary business account had been flagged by his bank pending the insurance commissioner's preliminary review. His line of credit, the one he used to finance new acquisitions, was suspended. 3 of his longest business partners had issued statements of distance in the careful language of people protecting themselves. By day 18, my father's attorney had contacted the hospital, a move that was both futile and revealing in its desperation, trying to establish grounds for a counter-complaint that would reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding. The hospital's legal team, who had their own documentation of what had occurred in their emergency department on day 1, declined to cooperate. Richard Wells did not go to prison, not immediately. The investigation would take time, as these things do, but the fraud findings, when confirmed, cost him his business license. The asset freeze that followed the IRS referral was sufficient to collapse the liquidity structure his operation depended on. A man who built everything on access to capital cannot survive a capital freeze. Within 48 hours of my filing, he was functionally bankrupt. He had gambled that I was worth less than the cost of saving me. He had miscalculated. Here is something I didn't expect. Winning didn't fix anything.
I want to be clear about that because I think when we tell these stories, when we trace the arc from betrayal to justice, there's a temptation to locate the healing in the victory, to say, and then the right thing happened, and so I was whole again. But that's not how any of this works. Justice and healing are not the same landscape. They don't even share a border. You can achieve one and still be entirely lost in the other. I achieved justice in 48 hours. I was working on healing for a long time after that. The first thing I had to confront was the grief. Not the anger, the grief. Anger was almost comfortable by comparison. Anger has direction, has momentum, gives you something to do with your hands. Grief just sits there. It doesn't ask you to act, it asks you to feel. And what I was grieving was not just my father's decision in that emergency room, as catastrophic as that decision was. I was grieving the Saturday floor, the 20 minutes with the index cards, the salmon dinners when he looked at me and I saw recognition in his face. I was grieving the father I had constructed across 29 years from insufficient materials, and the extraordinary, exhausting labor of that construction, and the discovery that the whole edifice had been built on a foundation of my own projection and need. He had never been who I needed him to be. He had been consistently and without deception exactly who he was. I was the one who had been telling a different story. And losing that story hurt in a way that the betrayal itself almost couldn't touch. I started seeing a therapist 6 weeks after I came home. Her name is irrelevant to this story, but her influence is not. She was the first person who said something to me that I needed to hear and could not have heard any earlier, which is that healing is not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness is not required for peace. I had been holding those two things as synonymous for my entire adult life. I thought peace was on the other side of forgiveness, and since forgiveness felt impossible, peace felt impossible. It isn't. It wasn't. What I found over the slow months of that first year was that peace is not the absence of pain, it's not the resolution of every wound, it's the ability to hold the wound without being organized by it, to say, this happened to me, and it was real, and it hurt, and it is also not the primary fact of my existence. I rebuilt my days very deliberately. I kept the plants, obviously, but I also started paying attention to what else I was tending, what else in my life had the quality of that morning ritual, that quiet reciprocity, that sense of caring for something that was genuinely alive and genuinely mine. I found a community garden 4 blocks from my apartment. I started going on Saturday mornings. I learned the names of the people who worked the plots around mine. I got good at growing things from seed. I went back to work, the real work, the work I'd been doing before the accident, the patient and precise work of finding the numbers that didn't fit. But I stopped suppressing what I found. I started following the threads. I had discovered, at significant personal cost, that looking away from the wrong thing is not the same as being safe from it. I stopped looking away. Daniel Osei, my colleague, the compliance officer who had watched me compile that evidence from a careful, professional distance, became a genuine friend in the aftermath. Not because he had helped me, he hadn't, but because he had witnessed me, and bearing witness to someone in an extremity, without judging what they choose to do with it, is its own form of loyalty. We had lunch every few weeks. We talked about work, and about systems, and about the strange moral texture of working in an institution that is simultaneously a place of healing and a place of commerce. He was good company. He asked the right questions. My relationship with Victor was, for a long time, simply absent. He did not contact me after those initial furious phone calls, and I did not contact him. There was a period, I'd be dishonest if I said otherwise, when I missed him in the abstract. Not Victor as he actually was, but the brother he might have been in a different family, in a different architecture of loyalty. The one who might have called me from the hospital waiting room on day 1 and said, "I disagree with what my father is doing. I need you to know that." That Victor had never existed.
but I grieved him anyway. 8 months after the accident, I received a letter from Victor. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, which I think was his attempt at sincerity in a medium he thought I couldn't dismiss too quickly. He did not apologize for his silence on the night of the accident. He did not address the DNR or my father's decision directly. What he said, in careful and somewhat tortured prose, was that he understood that the family had failed me, and that he was trying to understand his own role in that failure. I read the letter 3 times. I didn't respond for 2 months. When I did respond, I wrote 3 sentences. I told him I had received his letter. I told him I didn't know yet what I wanted our relationship to be. I told him I appreciated that he had written. It was the most honest thing I had ever said to my brother. It felt, in its smallness, like a beginning of something. Not a reconciliation, not a restoration, but the first honest coordinates of a map we might someday share. My father did not write. My father, as far as my direct experience is concerned, became a person who used to be my father. The investigation proceeded without my involvement. I had submitted the evidence. I had answered the investigators' questions in 2 separate interviews. And beyond that, the machinery of consequence operated independently of me, as it should. I watched none of it closely. I was told, eventually, the outcomes. I received them as information, rather than as resolution. Resolution was happening elsewhere. Resolution was happening in a community garden on Saturday mornings, in therapy on Tuesday afternoons, in my apartment in the specific quiet of 14 plants growing slowly in their containers, in morning light, asking nothing.
Here is what I know now that I couldn't have told you on the day I woke up. The thing my father took for me that night in the emergency room was not primarily my life. The hospital held my life. Dr. Nair held my life. My own body stubbornly, inexplicably held my life. What my father took, what he confirmed he had always withheld, was the belief that I was worth the cost of keeping. And here is the counterintuitive truth that I want to leave you with, the thing that took me a year of therapy and 14 plants and Saturday mornings with strangers in a community garden to understand. He couldn't take it. He never had it to take. My worth was never in his keeping. I had placed it there, carefully, over 29 years, in a deposit structure I had designed myself, organized around his approval and his attention, and the 20 minutes he spent on a Saturday floor when I was 6. I had built a vault and handed him the keys, and called it love. And when the vault turned out to be empty, when I cracked it open and found that the security I'd been protecting had never existed, the loss was not the loss of something he destroyed. It was the loss of something I could finally stop protecting. I am 30 years old now. I have 14 plants and a community garden plot and a compliance job I do with full attention and no suppression. I have a friend named Daniel who asks the right questions. I have an unfinished map with my brother that I tend the way I tend the peace lily, slowly, with attention, without forcing growth. I do not have a father in the functional sense of that word. I have a biological origin and a legal history and a set of memories, some of which are still precious and will always be precious, even now. And I have my life. I have my life because my body refused to let it go, and because a surgeon named Dr. Nair requested an ethics consult, and because the specific combination of who I am and what I know and what I had documented gave me the means to respond to what was done to me with precision rather than panic. I used to believe that silence was safety, that keeping quiet, staying small, not asking for more than I was offered, that this was how you survived in a family like mine. I know now that it was never safety. It was strategy, a strategy I no longer need. I flatlined on his terms. I came back on my own. And every morning I water my plants in order, starting from the window and ending in the bathroom. And they are growing, and I am growing, and the light comes through the glass without asking anyone's permission. That is enough. That is finally and completely more than enough. Have you ever been reduced to a number by someone who was supposed to protect you? How did you find your way back to yourself? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. What's one thing you learned about yourself after a betrayal? Share it below. You might be the voice someone else needed to hear today. And share one moment in your healing journey that changed everything. I want to hear about the turning point, however small it was, down in the comments. Let's heal together. You're not alone. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Please don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next transformation.